Hello friends, today we are going to discuss perhaps one of the most terrifying incidents in the history of mountaineering, the attempt to climb the north face of the Eiger in 1936. But first, let's talk about the Eiger mountain itself. Eiger, majestic and intimidating, rises in the Swiss Alps. Its summit barely reaches 3,970 meters, but by the 1930s, most of the major alpine faces had already been conquered. The north face of the Eiger, with its grim reputation and ominous legends, remained the last frontier for climbers of that time. It loomed over the Swiss town of Grindelwald like a challenge. Before we continue, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel. It's very easy to do and it means a lot to me. Your subscription is important because it motivates me to keep doing this work and helps in the channel's development. Thank you. Now, let's continue. At the beginning of the route, there were gentle approaches that gradually transitioned into practically sheer cliffs, but the most difficult sections began higher up, where the wall turned negative. From these impassable overhangs, constant rockfalls and avalanches cascaded down to the base of the wall. This place was aptly named the Death Wall. One of the most significant attempts to climb it occurred in 1935. In the summer, two climbers from Munich arrived in Grindelwald, 24-year-old Max Sedlmayr and 26-year-old Karl Mehringer, both already renowned for climbing Category 6 routes. They spent over a week studying the mountain and plotting their route. They ascended to the summit via a gentle slope and left provisions and gear there. On August 21st at 3 in the morning, the Bavarians began their ascent. They planned to complete the climb in 3 days, though they brought provisions for 6. As soon as the sun rose, everyone in Grindelwald watched them through binoculars and telescopes. Sedlmayr and Mehringer progressed steadily, overcoming the initial rocky bastion and stopping for the night just above the windows of the Eiger station. This was the first, relatively simple and safe section. The following day, spectators again observed the pair as they conquered another rocky barrier and the first ice field, a truly challenging obstacle for climbers of that era. Mountaineering was still in its infancy and much of the gear available to modern climbers was non-existent. Each climber experimented with and designed their own equipment. The old school of mountaineering clashed with the new, which was already experimenting with new tools, wedges and clamps. By the evening of the second day, the Bavarians had finally ascended the first ice field and settled down for another bivouac. The following day, the climbers' progress slowed significantly. They moved slower and slower and slower, sometimes sitting in one place for a long time. After overcoming another rocky belt, Sedlmayr and Mehringer reached the second ice field, which was steeper and longer. The weather began to deteriorate. When heavy clouds obscured the wall, the climbers were still on the second field. In the evening it started raining, and a strong wind began to blow, followed by a thunderstorm. The next day the weather did not improve, and the climbers disappeared from view, hidden by the clouds. On August 25th, spectators again saw two dark figures between the second and third ice fields. The first figure moved relatively quickly and everything seemed fine with them. The second figure moved much slower, likely experiencing severe fatigue or injury. Soon, clouds again obscured the wall, and a storm struck with renewed force. No one saw the climbers after that. A month later, German pilot Ernst Udet, flying around the summit, discovered a human body between the ice fields. It was impossible to tell who it was from the plane. The person stood on the slope, covered in snow up to their waist. According to the pilot, it looked like they were talking to the wall. This place was named the Death Bivouac. Spectators concluded that the climbers died from physical exhaustion and hypothermia. A year later, Heinrich Sedlmayr discovered his brother's body just below the windows of the Eiger station. The place where the body was found was right above the Death Bivouac and apparently had been swept away by an avalanche. The death of climbers in 1935 had a huge resonance as even the Swiss government temporarily banned ascents of the Eiger's north face. There were accusations against Swiss guides for insufficient qualifications, unable to prevent the tragedy. But bans on ascents often only attract more young and ambitious climbers. In May 1936, new attempts began. Two groups of climbers made successful exits, and in July of that year, Eiger and Eddie Rayner established their base camp under the Eiger's face. They managed to find a new route that bypassed the most difficult sections of previous attempts. However, their ascent was not smooth. During the climb, Eiger suffered a head injury from a rock, causing him significant discomfort. Despite this, they reached the second ice field and set up a temporary bivouac, deciding to rest until the weather improved. The next day was also filled with difficulties. The climbers did not anticipate that removing safety ropes on the third ice field would be fatal. This made the descent via the same route impossible. Despite all the challenges, they continued the ascent, reaching halfway up the wall. However, towards evening, after a midday bivouac, the group decided to abandon attempts to reach the summit. Eiger's condition worsened, and the situation on the third ice field became critical. The descent they began the next morning was even more difficult due to changing weather and icy conditions on the route. Attempts to traverse the Mountains.Stories.Lives traverse proved futile, and the group had to bivouac again on the glacier. The descent over the avalanche-prone slope proved extremely dangerous due to rockfalls and low temperatures. With every meter, progress became more challenging. Unfortunately, Eiger's condition deteriorated critically, leading the group to decide to leave him on the route and descend for help. At that time, a path inspector named Albert von Allman was inspecting the Eiger railway tunnel. It was his job to monitor the condition of the tracks and mechanisms, ensuring the tunnel was safe from collapses and other track inspector tasks. There was a technical gallery inside the tunnel that was drilled directly towards the Eiger's north face. It was this gallery that the climbers were aiming for, making a very difficult descent near the gallery. Inside the tunnel was a small room where one could rest and have tea. Albert knew that 4 young climbers were currently on the wall, knowing they were in serious trouble, and the inspector decided to go outside. Suddenly he saw something. He opened the massive wooden doors and found himself on the wall. Evening darkness, fog and rain prevented him from seeing anything several meters away. Then the inspector folded his hands into a horn and shouted into the darkness, and was very surprised when he heard an answering cry from above and to the left of him. Albert shouted several times that they had to go down here and went to put the teapot, hoping that the climbers would descend into his tunnel and join the tea party in a minute. The climbers were indeed very close. Here it is, the gallery, within arm's reach. Here it is, salvation is literally a few meters away, and you will sit in a warm chair, sipping tea with a railway path inspector. But at that moment an avalanche descended from the Eiger wall. Hinterstoicer, who was preparing the station, was not fastened to the safety rope, was instantly scattered down to the foot of the wall. Kurz, Eiger and Rayner were tied with one rope, passed through the carabiner, clicked in the rocky hook. The entire bundle is picked up by an avalanche. Eddie Rayner is trying to hold them from falling and is trying to break with an ice axe. And he does it. They reduce the speed, but the 2 climbers who were lower on the rope tear into the abyss and hang. From the jerk, Rayner received the heaviest chest injury. Also from the strong jerk, the rocky hook flew out of the wall and smashed his jaw. In addition, Eddie got tangled in the rope, which stretched under the weight of his friends and slowly strangled him. Next in line was Toni Kurz. He hung over the ledge and miraculously remained whole. The last in line was Eiger. From the fall, his pendulum hit the rock, so he died instantly. As a result, Toni Kurz was the only one alive in the bundle, who swung between 2 of his dead comrades. He hung in the air, unable to reach the rock. Meanwhile, in the tunnel, the inspector, after an hour and a half, decided to check again how these climbers were there. He opened the doors again, immediately heard, "Help, everyone else died. I am the only one left alive. Please help me." Toni Kurz cried. "I shouted to the right of you, Albert," and returned to the tunnel. From the tunnel, he called the station, which was at the foot of the western slope of the mountain. There, as the inspector knew, now a film expedition was located consisting of 3 experienced guides, Hans Schlaniger and brothers Christian and Adolf Ruby, who immediately set off to help the climber. They arrived at the gallery by a special train and climbed onto the wall. After a rather difficult ascent, they were just 50 meters from Kurt's hanging. They could not see him but heard perfectly. Guide said that if Toni will drop the rope to them, they will pass him food and all necessary. But Toni Kurz could not do this. He had no rope, no hooks, no hammer. In addition, he simply could not reach the wall. During the fall, his sleeve from the hand was gone and left hand did not work from frostbite. Because the rescuers were in a hurry, they had minimal equipment and could not simply save the climber from the rock. Moreover, the weather was spoiled and a new storm was approaching. They said that they will be back in the morning with backup and necessary equipment. Kurt screamed, "No, do not throw me. I will freeze to death here." But there were no options. A few hours later, they again went out on the wall. There were already 4 of them. They joined experienced rescuer Arnold Gladhard, and I believe that when the rescuers climbed onto the wall in the morning, they were very surprised to find Toni Kurz alive and conscious. He was still swinging between his 2 dead comrades, and it was unclear how to free him from there. To climb along the overhanging rock, separating the German climber from the rescuers, was absolutely no chance. Kurz insisted that the guides passed to the right where the climbers went up, and then on the rope to it. In the ascent, there were hooks which would greatly facilitate their task, and to descend in 3 or 4 ropes for experienced rescuers did not cause any difficulties. Swiss looked at each other. Toni Kurz himself did not understand what he was asking for. They were experienced guides. They took clients on fairly challenging routes. They participated in many rescue operations, but their qualifications were clearly insufficient for such a plan. None of them walked the 6th grade routes. Especially after a night storm, the stones were covered with ice. Rescuers tell Kurz that he will have to deal with himself and suggest a plan of action. Toni Kurz had to cut the rope with the dead angerer. Then he climbed to Eddie Reiner, unraveled his strangling rope to lower him to rescue us. They tied all the necessary equipment, food, another 30 meters of rope to it. These 30 meters of rope, if combined with the rope that Kurz already had, should have been enough to descend to the cherished mine. The question arises, why didn't they give him a normal 60-meter rope? Again, an accident intervened. The rescuers only had 1 long 60-meter rope. One of them, when he hurried to the injured, put it between his back and backpack. It was not something supernatural. Many climbers of those years wore ropes like that, but when he turned up, the rope flew into the abyss. Thus, the rescuers had only 30-meter segments of rope that they handed over to the victims. It took 5 long hours to implement this plan. He did all this with frostbitten hands, and now he just had to tie 2 pieces of rope and a carabiner to descend to the rescuers. This is a matter of 15 minutes. He tied 2 30-meter ropes and started his descent. There are literally 3 meters left to the rescuers. Here it is, salvation, but apparently from fatigue he hits the carabiner on the knot that tied the 2 ropes together. Under the weight of the climber, this knot was jammed in the carabiner and the climber simply couldn't move from the spot. The climber was literally hanging over the heads of the rescuers. They could speak, but removing him from the rock was almost impossible. One of the rescuers, Glahard, tried to help him by doing a very risky trick. He stood on the shoulders of one of the partners and tried to reach Kurz. He even managed to touch Toni with an ice axe, but that was not enough. He hung there for several hours. After a while, the guides heard the phrase "one can't anymore," and soon after that, Toni Kurz died. Before this climb, Toni Kurz told journalists, "This wall will be ours, or we will die on it." His body hung there for quite some time until one of the climbers cut it off with a knife attached to a long stick. So ended one of the most tragic climbs in the Alps. Several books and movies have been written about this story, such as North Wall and The Silent Siren. And the north face of the Eiger was conquered by Heinrich Harrer's group in 1938, but that's a completely different yet equally fascinating story that deserves a separate video. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like it, comment with your thoughts on the story. It would be very interesting to read. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. You can also share this video with your friends. They will surely find it interesting too. See you at the next summit.